Your film is now ready to be shown.
Good morning. I'm Justin Hendrix, editor of Tech Policy Press, a nonprofit media venture intended to provoke new ideas, debate, and discussion at the intersection of technology and democracy. On Wednesday, May 15th, a bipartisan U.S. Senate working group led by Majority Leader Senator Chuck Schumer released a report titled Driving U.S. Innovation in Artificial Intelligence, a Roadmap for Artificial Intelligence Policy in the United States Senate. The report follows educational and classified briefings for senators, as well as 9 AI Insight Forums hosted in the fall of 2023 that drew on the participation of more than 150 experts from industry, academia, and civil society. While some industry voices praised the report for its recommendations, with some exceptions, civil society reactions indicated disappointment, perhaps unsurprisingly given that Senator Schumer put innovation and competitiveness at the fore of the working group's agenda. The most significant criticisms came from civil rights and social and economic justice advocates, who chastised the report for putting industry interests ahead of the public interest and for appearing to cater to big tech and defense priorities. Still, others, including some who participated in the AI Insight Forums and have played prominent roles in setting AI policy in the Biden administration, faulted Senator Schumer's closed-door process and lack of recognition of prior work in the space, including on legislation. Just hours after the report was released, I spoke with 2 civil rights advocates who are working on AI policy. We discussed the good and the bad of the Senate report and how to set AI policy priorities more broadly that ensure a brighter future for all.
So my name is Claudia Ruiz. I'm a senior civil rights analyst at UnidosUS, which is the country's largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization.
And I'm Alejandra Montoya-Boyer, she, her AI pronouns, and I'm the Senior Director for the Center on Civil Rights and Technology at the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights.
I'm so pleased the 2 of you could join me today. We're talking just a few hours after Senator Schumer and the gang of 4 senators who led the AI working group have released their AI report that includes a range of different funding priorities and points to the possible development of future legislation and other activities the government feels it needs to study more in order to take on artificial intelligence. So it's a charged moment around AI policy in Washington. I just moderated a panel in the Dirksen Senate building, and one of the panelists was Spencer Overton from GW Law. He pointed out that the word innovation appears in the report more than 24 times, whereas the word bias only appears 3 times, twice in the appendix. I wanted to ask both of you, what do you make of the priorities that we have at the moment around AI? Are we taking civil rights seriously enough? Are we taking questions of equity seriously enough? Claudia, we'll start with you.
I think first and foremost, it's important to note that this is a report. This isn't a piece of legislation. This isn't any kind of document that carries significant authority. So I think while certainly there are some things that could have been done better, there are certainly some gaps that exist within the document. I think just acknowledging and recalling that this has no bearing on how committees of jurisdiction within Congress will actually go about the formal process of making new legislation around each of these different issue areas or around AI writ large, right? Like those are not necessarily, this document, it does little more than provide directional guidance. I think it's also important to remember that I think Leader Schumer was very clear, and the larger group of 4, the AI task force, was very clear that the document was trying to identify areas of consensus in particular. And I think that's where some of this falls down. And I think, again, this report, it's about managing expectations. This report was a culmination of all of the Insight Fora that Leader Schumer had hosted throughout the fall of 2023, and I think even a little bit earlier into this year and this winter. And I think that you could already tell there was a very heavy industry slant. There was a very heavy, each fora was overloaded with tech industry voices that outnumbered civil society voices. I can even say I was in the room at the very first inaugural fora, and I think there were maybe 4 or 5 civil rights leaders' voices compared with a dozen, if not more, industry leader voices. So I think in many ways, the report is exactly what we could have come to expect, given just the cast of characters in the crowd that was brought into also a closed door, right, process that was on the Hill.
Alejandra, how about you? What did you make of this report today?
I want to echo what Claudia is saying and really emphasize that this is a report. It is not enforceable law or even a proposal for legislation. So that in and of itself is a bit limiting. Additionally, there is definitely a focus on the tech industry and innovation over the real world harms that could and do come from AI systems. And so I think we just need to be honest about what this report is trying to do, building consensus and promoting the bipartisanship that is necessary to enact legislation on the Hill right now is important. But we also need to take seriously the opportunity to protect civil rights, to avoid and mitigate harm that AI systems are doing. And the reality is, you asked about innovation. Technological innovation is not innovative unless it's including all of us. Our view of innovation is that civil rights protections and mitigating harm has to be at the forefront. And this report does not go anywhere near far enough in that.
Let's talk a little bit about what you and your organizations are doing to advance the vision you have. I'd love to hear from both of you what you've been up to over the last 6 months, as you've been tracking what's going on, of course, across the Capitol, across the country, around the ideas you've put forward. And maybe I'll come back to you, Claudia, on some of the work you've been doing. Can you characterize what a day in the life is like for you advocating around AI issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I might do is start off with our sort of AI policy platform, or 3 key principles that we have guiding all of our AI policy and advocacy work. And we call those values, voices, and investment. Those are our 3 pillars. Values represents the notion that tech and any kind of governance framework for technology and emerging technologies should be grounded in democratic norms and constitutional principles. So they should be rights protecting, rights advancing, right? Not merely just be unbiased, but actually advance rights, opportunity, and equity across communities and across impacted groups. Next is voices. So voices represents the idea that we need to have a diverse community of stakeholders that are engaged in the governance process as we figure out and sort out what looks like appropriate regulation, what looks like appropriate oversight, what are appropriate accountability mechanisms to ensure that those values that I just mentioned at the beginning are actually happening and deployed in the real world once technologies are actually deployed. And then third is investment. And investment kind of refers to this idea that impacted groups and historically marginalized groups oftentimes have been left out or left behind by tech because of a lack of capacity, a lack of resourcing, and a lack of support. So together, those are like the 3 main sort of guiding principles from which we do our day-to-day policy and advocacy. So on any given day, it could look like something like meeting with regulatory agencies to talk about ways to embed anti-discrimination protections in an ongoing rulemaking that was directed by the AI executive order. For example, specifically, we're very concerned around the use of facial recognition technologies by law enforcement and immigration enforcement agencies. So that's one area of concerted focus for us. That also comes up a lot in discussions around data privacy. So around APRA, the soon to be formally introduced comprehensive federal data privacy bill, and figuring out ways in which we can leverage sort of privacy enhancing techniques to actually advance and protect civil rights, protect against discrimination, and protect against bias. For the second, when it comes to voices, that means working with our coalition partners, working with kind of other groups that have not necessarily historically played in the sort of tech policy space, and making sure that we're supporting them and bringing them into the process and into the fold as well. And I would say that also extends even further here at Unidos, in that we work with our affiliate network, which is a network of over, I think at this point, 309 community-based organizations across the country. These are grassroots community-level organizations that provide direct services and do program implementation at the community level for Latino and immigrant communities and communities of color. So it's engaging with them, making sure that we are doing the appropriate kind of resourcing and supports for them, helping those organizations navigate what this new kind of AI-driven world looks like. And then also, of course, performing and hosting listening sessions, gathering feedback so we can create a pipeline of voices, again, from on the ground at the community level all the way up to Congress, lawmakers, policymakers, and so on and so forth. And then on the investment side, Some of those activities might look like pushing for concerted funding for something like the Affordable Connectivity Program, or ACP, which is a program to help make sure we can close the digital divide so that we can make sure that we do have the kind of workforce and the appropriately digitally skilled employee base from which to employ from, when a lot of this funding, infrastructure funding, the $32 billion mentioned in today's AI white paper, making sure that there is the human infrastructure and the human piece that can actually deploy all of this investment and make sure that AI and the goals that we have, the positive goals we have for AI, can actually be achieved.
We just talked about the issue of connectivity and how it connects the kind of shared vision of prosperity through AI in the future. Last week in this podcast, in a conversation about how AI policy might be different in rural contexts, or certainly in other contexts where individuals have more limited connectivity. Alejandra, let me come to you as well for a similar kind of question. I assume a day in the life for you is still settling in. You're in a new position and also in a team that's new and growing.
Yeah, exactly. I want to start with the critical emphasis on the fact that we actually just launched the center here at the Leadership Conference. So the Center for Civil Rights and Technology was launched in September 2023, really hoping to be this first of its kind hub for advocacy, education, and research at the intersection of civil rights and technology policy, really recognizing the emphasis on AI and emerging technologies and the impacts it's having all across our lives, whether we realize it, recognize it, or not. And the fact that marginalized communities are both at risk and are being somewhat left out of the process for how AI is not only regulated, but implemented in our lives. As Claudia was saying around broadband access, for example, we know that communities of color, particularly Black, Latino, and tribal communities, are much less likely to have access to quality and affordable internet. So how do we make sure that we're having conversations that center and bring voice to the communities most impacted by these decisions? And that's really the goal of the center. So similarly, our day-to-day lives look like, as a coalition organization, we're really bringing together our coalition partners, including UnidosUS and other civil rights organizations, to engage around our three priority issues: AI and privacy, voting and platform accountability, and broadband access. But we're also really interested in looking at how this technology is impacting other critical policy arenas and issue areas. For example, we work in connection with our justice team to understand and inform policymakers and our coalition partners on the impacts that AI have on predictive policing systems, facial recognition technology, and other impacts for police reform and criminal justice. So, for example, my background is really in economic justice and the impact that this technology could have on the racial wealth gap and other things like our workforce and employment systems, access to homeownership and housing opportunities, credit lending. We know that AI and tech is really going to define so much of our economic systems. And what's really important is that we're trying to emphasize that this is one of the first times in any sort of revolution like this where communities of color and marginalized communities have a seat at the table to help define and hopefully centralize focus around the folks most harmed by these issues.
Let me ask you both, and especially since Claudia brought up the issue of the disproportionate representation of industry at the Senate AI forums. You might agree by the end of the ninth one, it had evened out a bit, but certainly I think many in civil society were concerned at the outset that they appeared to be stacked towards industry interests and certainly towards this North Star of innovation above all else. But let me ask each of you, how do you engage with industry, or do you engage with industry in your work? What are those conversations like without betraying confidences? Are you finding your brand of ideas have purchase inside the big tech companies? Are there individuals there who want to hear from you, who are actively working with you, and who are creating the type of change you want to see?
I would say the short answer is yes. So at Unidos, we do have a number of corporate partnerships. We do have a corporate board of advisors. And so we have cultivated with certain key corporate or industry leaders relationships and everything where we can provide feedback on sort of their services, their policies, or their products. And vice versa, sometimes, right, they can provide support by way of resourcing investment to, for example, support some digital skilling programs, to support financial literacy programs, and so on and so forth. So I can even say that at Unidos, we partner, one of our big corporate partnerships is with Google. And in particular, one of the programs that they help us implement is something called Digital Skills for Life, which is the kind of like 101 of digital skilling, which we do go ahead and implement at the community level through our affiliates. So I think that it's important to recognize, and we also saw this, I think, last fall with the announcement of the partnership between AFL-CIO and Microsoft. In many ways, those private-public partnerships are really what's going to be key to making sure that this North Star of innovation is actually done in the fashion that Alejandra mentioned at the beginning, which is to say that it's inclusive and maximizing opportunity and benefits for all of us, not just the select few that have benefited from technology so far. So I think that there's a lot of groundwork and a lot that can be achieved by working closely with industry leaders. Again, I think the other kind of piece to this is the fact that the democratic process can be slow. It does necessarily have to be a little bit slow sometimes for the ways in which we can make sure that we're getting enough input, diverse perspectives, and so on and so forth. And so sometimes if you can work with the policy teams at, let's say, some of the tech companies, those are some ways in which you can help influence some of the policy setting rather than having to go incentivize good, responsible, ethical policies around technology, rather than necessarily having to wait around for a Congress to pass a piece of legislation or an agency to engage in the rulemaking process. So I think there's absolutely plenty of room to actually advance benefits and civil rights interests, certainly through corporate partnerships, but that also doesn't necessarily mean that they're perfect, right? Just like all kind of relationships within the tech policy ecosystem, I think there can be some drawbacks. And some of the times we don't always necessarily agree. One other example that I'll give is we used to have a corporate partnership with Facebook, formerly Meta, and we unfortunately had to end that corporate partnership in the wake of the Facebook papers, just because of the ways in which we felt sometimes a corporate relationship is not really producing the kind of outcomes that either party really wants. So again, I think it is unfortunately, or maybe fortunately in some ways, the nature of the ecosystem itself, where engagement directly with industry and with corporations and with the entities that are responsible for creating these products at the ground level, making sure that there is some kind of through line, let's say, to make sure that we're letting them and helping them think about what they don't know and pointing out to them the things that they don't know that they don't know.
Alejandra, how about for you? How do you all work with industry?
Yeah, so I think similarly to Unidos and what Claudia is describing, the Leadership Conference does engage with a number of different corporate partners, both inside of the center and outside of the center. The center's approach has really been to we have a handful of partners that we engage with on the regular basis, primarily the big tech companies and platforms, particularly around issues around the election, around voting protection, and really to ensure that platforms take responsibility that their products and business processes protect civil and human rights, that they don't result in harm or bias, particularly towards marginalized people. The relationship has shifted over time. And as you can imagine, based on different leadership within those or within the companies and the way that the companies themselves are structured in terms of their community engagement teams, their policy teams, and quite honestly, their commitment to civil rights. But we are in constant communication with the big platforms. We are continuously urging, particularly social media platforms, to focus on content moderation and particularly on disinformation around the election. We see a lot of hate speech and anti-immigrant, anti-Black, really racist rhetoric online, and we work to make sure that the platforms recognize the harms that they can exacerbate. But those relationships ebb and flow, as you can imagine. We will continue to press them. One of our big, as I mentioned before, one of our big policy priorities is around that platform accountability. We're also really trying to think through the strategy beyond the big tech companies that we've had long-standing relationships with, thinking about the fact that with AI and other emerging technologies, basically every company is adapting and implementing these types of tools and becoming some form of a tech company. So this goes beyond Google, Microsoft, Meta, TikTok. We need to start thinking, as I mentioned before, about the banks and lenders. We need to be thinking about housing and renting spaces, the hiring and workforce companies. And I'm constantly reiterating the economic justice focus groups, but it's across the board. And so our platform accountability strategy is really looking to grow beyond just the traditional tech companies.
And I want to pick up on what Alejandra said and really reinforce that, which is, right, we have the traditional, what we think of as the big tech platforms, right, the big tech companies. But right, with the advent of AI, it's like, it feels like every company is now a tech company. How many times a day do we see, or at least even at my own organization, to use an example, right? We are bombarded constantly with new kind of AI systems or AI tools that can be deployed for nonprofit use or for workforce or for education or for health, right? It's now no longer necessarily just about like the big players that have been around for a while. It's now even seeing the smaller startups, the smaller AI companies that have maybe smaller, more targeted tools. We're seeing those again, at Unidos at the very least. We're contacted almost daily, right, with a new product that could be used, a new tool that could be deployed. So I think it's also very important to, like Alejandra is mentioning, right, keep in mind the fact that it's no longer just about, right, the tech industry that we have come to know at this point. It's now broadening in scope, and it's happening across sectors.
That gives me a chance to ask you a question. Just looking at the written testimony you helped prepare for the House Energy and Commerce Committee, I believe a hearing on safeguarding data and innovation, building the foundation for the use of artificial intelligence. This was last fall. I know one of the things that you called for is going up the pipe, away from all those entities that are becoming tech firms that just deploy AI, towards looking at foundation model developers specifically. You call for a regulator that would be especially focused on those things. Can you just explain your rationale?
It's not so much that it has to be a completely brand new standalone entity. At the end of the day, that's not necessarily my area of expertise, so I'll leave that to the lawmakers. But what we are calling for is this notion and this vision of at least a dedicated division, right, that can actually go toe-to-toe as quickly, right, and keep pace with the rapid evolution of foundation models and larger AI systems. And so I think it's making sure that the expertise is embedded within a certain area within government, with a specific government body, to tackle and address these issues specifically, because they are, as much as they are part and parcel of the larger conversations around AI regulation and oversight, at the end of the day, they present a very unique and very specific use case that is not necessarily the same as some of the other issue areas that Alejandra mentioned, right? Some of the more narrow context around, let's say, in the healthcare context or the housing context, or even the policing context. I think foundation models represent a different kind of animal, in the sense that they tend to be very squishy models, very large models, and it can be very difficult to actually anticipate how they may be used for good, but also certainly how they may be misused for nefarious purposes or other kind of harmful intentions and impacts. But yeah, so I think it's important to really call out, right, specifically these larger foundation models and these larger systems, because even just this week, right, we saw ChatGPT 4.0 come out, right? We saw Google now introduce its new AI overviews in its search engine, right? These happened back to back, just days before the AI white paper that was released today by Leader Schumer. And so the other thing that I wanted to lift up is that we really do need to provide concerted attention to these larger foundation models and these larger systems. And so I think that another kind of thing that I might say about that report, circling back to the beginning of the conversation, is that, again, while the report is, a commendable attempt to identify areas of consensus, to identify areas of daylight across the aisle, what it really only does is just that, right? Provide direction and guidance. And meanwhile, while a lot of policy and lawmakers were very focused on producing this report, meanwhile, a lot of the larger tech companies and these large foundation models have been able to, again, continue to evolve and advance and take us to a way different place than we were even when the start of the fora happened last fall.
Alejandra, I want to ask you a question, and maybe this is a little more speculative. I know the Leadership Conference has been invited to advise various groups, in particular the Department of Homeland Security, which is given a huge portfolio in the Biden executive order for rolling out AI policy in domestic security context. Is there anything you can tell us about your group's involvement in that process and anything that you're learning there generally?
I want to set expectations that the DHS's task force just kicked off. They've had an initial meeting, which my understanding is that it was predominantly focused on what the actual scope of the task force would be, and felt a little bit limiting, particularly to the civil rights and civil liberties groups that were included in that conversation, really advocating to broaden the scope beyond DHS's proposals to focus on infrastructure, where a bunch of the civil society groups are really hoping to broaden that scope to include, a greater lens to be able to discuss the impact that AI is having on immigration systems, law enforcement, and beyond. I will say, outside of the DHS task force, the leadership conference and the center in particular is deeply engaged with the agencies in the way that they're working on implementing the White House executive order, engaging the chief AI officers that are being put into place to be able to support the actions of the agencies. One of the things that we're particularly looking at, as we talked about around police systems, is making sure that policies around AI are recognizing the harm that's already happening. We have many examples of particularly Black folks being misidentified using facial recognition technology. So knowing that AI has biases coming from the humans that make them, how do we make sure that the regulatory frameworks we're developing are responsive to AI, that we're not deploying technology that increases the harm and really upholds current civil rights laws, recognizing the ways that we have the current powers that we have to regulate technology. So we've been in a significant process to engage different agencies in those conversations, some of which are like the tactical opportunities to meet with the agencies, also to respond to different RFI and provide comments and letters that showcase the policies that we're committed to supporting. And then beyond that, I think we're really hoping to foster, like back to the report as we're talking about, what is a more comprehensive approach to AI governance and regulation. That right now it's a little bit piecemeal, and we're definitely in recognition and applauding the White House for their executive order. But until we're at a place where we have this comprehensive approach, there's always going to be holes in regulation, and different agencies, different places will be able to respond to things differently. There's a nuanced approach in the way that the executive order can be read, and different agencies will take it more or less seriously. I'm trying to, that's just a critique that we're trying to balance, that the reality is until there's comprehensive regulation, that we just won't see enough from the agencies.
Sounds to me like, listening to the two of you, that while folks in the AI industry might be busy, the people working on these policy issues might be even busier. I'd love to know from each of you what you think the next 6 months looks like. We've got an election coming. What will be your priorities? Maybe, Claudia, we'll start with you.
I think for certain, a lot of the deadlines that were set within the AI executive order we're coming right up against them. I know a lot of them are sprinkled across May, June, July, and some of those deadlines even take us into the fall. So it is going to be continuing, like Alejandra mentioned over at the leadership conference. We're going to be doing the same thing, continuing to engage the agencies, making sure providing support there, providing input, providing feedback, and helping them comply with the directives that were given to them within the AI executive order. So that's one, concerted area of focus for us. Though also, again, I just wanted to acknowledge and say the quiet part out loud is that, right, an AI like that executive order, like all executive orders, right, can completely become obsolete in the event of an administration change. So we are definitely trying to make sure that we can get the best outcome, right? And the best kind of outputs from the rulemaking process that all of the agencies are undergoing right now. It is also keeping in mind that should there be a change in administration, whether this election or the following or any future elections, right? A lot of this work could be undercut and undermined and just revoked. So I did just want to flag that. I think when it comes to looking at the Hill, we're about 4 weeks. We have about 4 weeks left in this session. So there's a lot to try to get done. Like I mentioned, there's APRA, there's comprehensive federal data privacy on the table right now. There's some funding to get emergency funding and even long-term legislative proposals to keep ACP around. So there's USF reform to help facilitate that process. So a lot to get done within the next 4 weeks. I think another kind of area that I would call out, right, is again, keeping in mind the election the season that is well underway. Another area of focus is that we really want to see maybe if we cannot have, which clearly I don't think is going to happen in 4 weeks, if we cannot have some kind of comprehensive AI legislative package, at the very least, we can zero in on sort of the highest impact, highest risk use cases. And the one that I will call out in this case is certainly the threats to elections and democracy and what we can do between, again, right now in election time to make sure that we have enough protections in place to make sure that we can not have those kind of ongoing threats that we already know are coming when it comes for whether it's from misinformation, disinformation, using AI to send out these mass campaigns about misinformation about time and place to vote, or even mischaracterizing parties, platforms, and issues. So I think that really zeroing in and focusing on what we can do on those ends is really important, and it's certainly going to be an area of focus for us.
And we saw some progress on AI and elections in the Senate today, but still seems the clock's run out.
Yeah, and I think the Klobuchar bills. I think what you're referring to, and I think right at the same time, it's interesting because some of those election bills are the best informed, I might say. So I think that if anything, it's another rich area, not only for the dire need to have protections in place, but I also think it's an area where the harms are at least a little bit more spelled out. The mechanisms for which to address those harms or prevent or even just mitigate those harms is more well thought out. And I would say this is also what Alejandra was saying. This is where our relationship with some of the social media platforms or corporate relationships with some of the social media platforms gets called back in, because in the absence of being able to get something done, at the very least, what we can do is communicate with those social media platforms and make sure that their content moderation policies are aligned with what we need to protect our voters and protect our election officials even, and certainly protect our democracy and 2024 elections writ large.
I think on the elections piece, we've heard whispers of the fact that there is potential opportunity for movement on and focus on the somewhat limited in scope legislation that was brought to the Rules Committee today. Maya Wiley testified on behalf of some of the pieces of these bills in the fall. And so really just emphasizing that the election is such a critical moment, but it's also already May. We have to recognize the limitations on the Hill, even just being able to pass any type of legislation, things being attached to must-pass bills. There's just a lot of limiting factors. And so it is a deep priority for the leadership conference that we're focusing on the impacts that AI-generated misinformation, disinformation, or as the report did say today, objectively false information, and the way that that is shared and turbocharged online and on social media. And so I think that's something we're deeply worried about right now, recognizing we only have a few months. And that will definitely be a key focus for us. And just wanted to emphasize that coalition partners and the ecosystem is really clamoring to figure out how do we emphasize this, not just for legislation, but as Claudia was saying, to the platforms who frankly don't have much regulating forces over them right now. And so our platform accountability strategies really come at them wanting to do the right thing as best as possible. And so it can be quite limiting.
I can hear the urgency in both of your voices on these issues, and I hope that urgency is also with lawmakers and leaders in the White House. But perhaps we can bring you two back and do a little post-mortem after the election, find out where things stand. I'm grateful to both of you for speaking to me today.
Thanks so much, Justin. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Looking forward to speaking with you again.
That's it for this episode. I hope you'll send your feedback. You can write to me at justin@techpolicy.press. Thanks to my guests, thanks to my co-founder Brian Jones, and thank you for listening.
Tech Policy Press.